glaze this down. I have a piece of cotton t-shirt rag. I'm going to start to work into it. Trying to push the charcoal in. Sometimes I think, even just pushing it straight down before you try to smear it. Kind of what I'm trying to do is set the stuff in place, soften it up. Trying to cancel out some of that white paper as well. I have a piece of paper towel here, just slightly different. Still the same idea. I'm trying to save some of the good stuff by pushing it in and also kind of smearing that charcoal around just a little bit. And soaking up some of the stuff that's too thick as well. So very intuitive, I guess, in a way. You don't want to overblend or overglaze, but you definitely need to do enough. Alright, well, I want to get started on the erasing phase of this drawing. I have a pink pearl eraser. That's typically one eraser I'm going to start with. It's fairly new, but it's a little dirty. I'm just going to go ahead and get started. My strategy here is I want to start to apply light in a kind of systematic way, moving from the top of the image in sort of a logical progression downward to the front and bottom. So I'm going to start with things that are sort of up high and far away from me, and kind of start to piece together the planes of light that are facing up in this image. So every object now is sort of its own little individual thing. You need to sort of take your eraser and try to respond to what you're seeing. So, alright, let's go ahead. I'm just going to take out some light, and some texture also is happening up here in these flowers. But I'm not really trying to erase or clean it up. I'm just trying to lift light off of planes. I want to actually kind of use a very fluid motion. If my glaze is set up correctly, this works beautifully. And I want to let that eraser kind of drag and skid and flow and not get too constricted actually in the shapes that I've established. So the eraser is kind of like the light source. It's kind of fluid and moving, and kind of temporal or transitory. So if you can bring a little bit of that quickness to your observations as well, it can also help to kind of keep the drawing a little more lively. It's just my drafting brush. So I'm just taking that eraser and kind of letting that sharper edge, that little bit of that cleaner pieces of the eraser kind of touch the paper lightly, and lifting out planes of light on the surface of these objects. This is just very enjoyable activity once you get the hang of some of these erasing concepts. You can kind of see, even just starting to apply some light and shadow to the top planes of these objects, starts to look like effects of light. It's very exciting, it's fun, you get a lot of quick results. And you can see that, you know, there sort of is a kind of method for creating things in charcoal. And I always like to remind myself you got to start up high because that's where the light is brightest. So this is going to start up on the top of these objects and let my eraser kind of naturally find the pathway of lighting down the object. Sometimes I have to skip a gap, jump down, start to pick up some light here on the face and on the hair. All that cast shadow down. I'm going to stay away from the face for just a moment, and I want to bring some light into the torso. Again, this is just all pink pearl here that I'm using. It's like pink eraser. Just sometimes I'm pressing down, letting it kind of slide. Okay, so there's some anatomy here. It's subtle, but there's some bones and muscles that are receiving light here in the pit of the neck. When I'm erasing, I think about the eraser and the light is always coming from the top, and I'm just trying to find sort of pathways that allow me to move down the object in kind of fluid and seemingly, you know, logical kinds of ways. Okay, so the face is kind of a special area, so I wanted to sort of establish some of the bigger shapes on this figure, and then I'm going to come back and work on the face a little bit more as a kind of individual part. Still going to start with my pink pearl, but I can be a little more localized, and I probably should anticipate that I'll need a pencil eraser as well. If your pencil eraser has a shape or is a little dirty, you don't like it, you can just take a razor blade and nip end of that off. So I have a couple different erasers here in my hand. It will be hard to see them on camera because with this eraser what I recommend you do is let out a good inch or so, and then what you do is you take your index finger, you hold it like this, see, and you can turn it upside down, and that kind of lets you point your own finger right at where you want to direct the light. I'm going to start with the pink pearl. I like to start with shapes that are a little bit more broad in their start here. There seems to be the most light up here. There's always typically the most light on the forehead. Nice strong cast shadow shape here that you can look at and reference. Okay, so this shape that's occurring here along the side of the face on the cheek, that's a cast shadow that has a sharp edge. Back to my pink pearl here, so like that. For again, what that's going to do is let the eraser skid a little bit, flow a little bit. I'm really not pressing very hard. And there's a lot of times when I'm not pressing all the way to the full pressure. I'm just sort of leaving some of the charcoal on the paper too, to create more moderate kinds of colors. So you don't have to erase as much to get some of those transitional shades. Okay, there's a series of little up-facing planes here on the lips and the mouth and the chin. Upper lip right under the nose, there's typically a little cast shadow there. See some darkness here, and then it's dark on the upper lip. Got some light occurring on the lower lip. More light setting up here on this top of the chin. There's three places of light typically that start to look for. And then there's another little bit of a muscle out here, corner of the mouth, that needs some light on it. Upper lip, little muscle pull out here at the side of the mouth, up facing plane on the lip and on the chin. What happens is artists start to memorize those little shapes of light and where to look for them. And it helps us predict how to draw faces. And the thing about faces and drawing them is, if you are going to be an artist, they never go away. You're always going to have to know how to draw lips and eyes and noses. So you should just get started on it and take some classes. But just practicing it is also really one of the best things to do. The great thing about drawing people is, we all have that anatomy to reference. So what you can do is you can kind of memorize some designs for facial features. It's kind of like memorizing letters or characters when you're learning to write. So you learn some letters and characters, places, facial features that you can insert in place when you need them. And it helps you speed up what you're doing. If you don't have all that, you can use books and other references to help you figure out how other artists have drawn eyes and noses and lips as well. And that's another great way to learn. This is a blending stick. I'm just using that to kind of smooth out some of the smaller details here. Places where the erasing has actually gotten too light. Shadows, I want to go back and kind of smooth out some of the colors inside the shadows and around in the space tone, around the edges of the form. And when you have something that you're trying to create as a focal point that has high detail, it's going to be the area that needs sort of the most attention and care and softening, okay? Because what's happening is as the more that you are developing it, you're sort of calling attention to it. And so that development is also helping to establish a kind of focal point area. So it's the combination of this intriguing subject matter, which is the face, and then the additional development and softening and looking for details and trying to smooth out some of the roughness. That's what's going to draw your viewers in and make them sort of look for a longer period of time at your artwork. So just a blending stick. Using it a lot here just to kind of soften up some shadow planes. Smooth out some of this existing charcoal. There's already quite a bit of charcoal on the page. So I just want to try to work with a little bit of it to soften it up so it doesn't get too heavy. Not pressing terribly hard either. And my blender has some charcoal in it already, which is kind of acting a little bit like a brush. Next thing I want to do is take a chamois. Mine's a little bit dirty. I wish I had one that's a little cleaner, but it's okay. Even if it has a little dirt in it, it's still all good. I want to polish up some of these lighted planes that I've been erasing on the figure. And maybe some of these halftone middle colors here in some of these side planes. So top planes, side planes, planes where you've been erasing. That's where you want to drag your chamois. You would want to avoid dragging your chamois into the shadows. So use your blender or other tools in the shadow, like maybe even tissues or cotton. If I drag my chamois through my shadows, what's going to happen is it's going to strip off, make things maybe a little too light in some of those planes that I've already kind of worked hard to establish. This back to my pink pearl. I'm still just working on some of these shapes down here in the neck. I just see that there's a kind of dark shape here that my drawing looks too rough, and I can just use some of the existing charcoal to glaze it in a little bit deeper, and it kind of smooths out. It starts to look more like a shadow. Just using little circular swipes now to kind of buff in or polish in some of these lighter, grainier spots inside of this shadow plane. It takes a minute to sort of, soften up this charcoal. You can't rush it. I don't want to try to overdo it too quickly either, because if I push too hard or make too sudden of movements, it just doesn't work out so good. I don't want to change the paper so much that I can't ever work on it. So it's a kind of finding the right pressure here to get your work done is a challenge. A little bit of a highlight here on the corner. Back to my pink pearl again. What I haven't really gone back to yet is any charcoal. For the most part, I'm trying to avoid adding more dark to the surface right now. But I want to use what's here and my eraser and my chamois to lift off or reduce if I have too much. If I get it something too light, I can always come back and add more or use the blending stick. So through this method of kind of glazing and erasing and then using my blender that I can achieve lots of these side plane, 25%, 50% soft kind of colors that are difficult to understand how to do well sometimes for beginners. Get that pattern of light and shadow established on your drawing, you're just going to look so much more advanced than someone who is only, outlining something. Alright, I should move along. I think I should probably work on some of these other flowers here on this side now. Don't want to, get too fixated. That's another issue with working on complex drawings, long-term drawings. You have to pace yourself. I'm just cleaning off the margin a little bit. Things like flowers, it's better, I think, not to try to overwork them too soon, but just kind of tap at them, get a little bit of light established, lift out some of those top planes, try to get their shapes to kind of come into focus, but don't overdo it too soon. You've got to balance out, what's happening in the rest of the picture. If you are to drawing small details over here on the side of the frame too tightly or too early on, you're going to be pulling our attention away from the focal point and from the center of the page. So don't do this kind of thing where you get too trapped on something that's only a secondary object. You have to balance your time and energy and make decisions about what's going to be more or less important. Right now I'm kind of just blending out some of the space tone behind these flowers because there's a lot of static or energy back there that's distracting. And when I blend it out, what's happening is I'm pushing the background layer further away from our eyes. just trying to blend out some of the negative spaces a little bit behind those flowers. A little bit. Clean up some of the white speckles in the paper helps to reduce the staticky look or the noisiness from the grainy swiping kind of thing that you get with charcoal. Okay, I have some folds of cloth here that I want to start to pull some light in on the top planes. These are kind of complex looking folds and a little bit far away and blurry, so I am actually kind of simplifying them. And what I'm essentially doing is turning them into little cylinders or little pipe folds that are receiving some light on the top surfaces. I'm counting 3 main chunks here, maybe 4 actually. There's another one back here that's starting to emerge. And perhaps if I had printed this in color, it would be a little easier for me to see what's happening back here too. I could also look at it on a screen, but I'm just gonna, I know what it is, so I'm gonna interpret it. But if you need a little bit more information to work with, if you're going to try this drawing, you can look at this file in color as well. Sometimes the color actually helps you figure out how to draw objects. Other times it's very distracting for beginners especially to have to draw charcoal using a color photograph. What I typically do with drawing is I'm going to reduce some of the color. There's a little bit of color in this one. Let me look at this one. This one's got a little more yellow in it. You know, I think I can see maybe a tiny bit more. But I did okay. I basically have the kind of shapes back there that I'm going for at this point. Kind of hard to explain sometimes to beginners, but you don't necessarily need to overdo everything. Sometimes just getting something started and having a little faith in the process is really the best thing. And just sort of tap at some of those up-facing planes, maybe blend a few shadows, and move along and just kind of have faith that you did okay. You have to get to some point where you sort of say, all right, I'm ready to, you know, move on from that area. Some light here on this flower. Have to kind of use a responsive and interpretive motion, a sort of approach, a movement and flow, starting typically from the top down and letting my eraser tap out or touch on some of the key up-facing planes on these complex shapes. Okay, just going to be like little squiggles of light or shapes of light that I'm kind of swiping out at first, and then this kind of weird thing happens. It's like if you just stay with it, eventually it starts to sort of come into focus and becomes manipulative, malleable, or you can see it better. You know, you can start to manipulate it. Taking some of that thick black outline that I did on purpose, that I knew was going to be too strong. I'm using that thick black outline in order to kind of protect the shape of the flower, but also to help me blend in some of these darker little closure marks, these background spaces here behind the flower. So sometimes that strong outline is not a bad thing. Get started with it and you can blend it away. What I'm doing here is just sort of counting and looking at the flower petals and sort of making sure I have little shapes of light that correspond to the planes that I see. And I haven't tried to clean this up or add any more depth to it. Just trying to establish some of those initial value patterns that are so challenging for beginners to understand how to do. Got to put these tones in place first before you can do really any detail work on a drawing like this or on a painting. Similar strategy. You've got to mass in your planes. Got to get some value patterns established before you can create the finished look. I like to remember, the margin is going to be the margin. Parts of the margin are going to be some of the brightest things in your whole drawing. So what I'm doing here is I can actually look at the color of the white paper versus the top of this flower, and you might think, oh, that flower is white. I know a lot of beginners do, but then I say, hey, look, students, look at, there's white right here in the margin, and then what color is that shape right next to it? Well, it's not nearly as white as the blank paper. So that's kind of a rule, is you don't want stuff on the inside of the image, especially around your borders, to what we call bleed out. So we want to make sure that there's some tone on our inside of our image. It helps to hold everything together when there's value all the way around at the edges and nothing seems to be lost into the margin. So I should be able to, erase off that margin as needed, because that's the brightest thing on my page. Now, what I'm doing is I like to have this sort of organic, hand-drawn margin. Because I enjoy that sort of challenge of developing the tones inside of the image and keeping this a little bit clean. But I want this edge actually to be a little bit faded or loose somehow. You've got to play around with it, develop your own sensibilities. But as the values inside of the image start to mature, it should be easier to keep the margin clean. And this is just an index card. Sometimes you can use that as a kind of frisket or a masking stencil. It can help you lay that down and erase the margin against your image too. The reason I grabbed this card here is I have a sharp front plane here on this piece of card. There's like this is a mat from a picture frame. It's laying flat on the table to create kind of shape in your still life. It's just a piece of thick paper, basically. It's got a straight edge. It's kind of like a little thin block or brick. Got a front leading edge here on it that I'm using this index card to clean up a little bit. just my blender here, helping me make decisions about, the colors around where I'm erasing. This is a top plane, but it's not as bright as the paper. Sort of a color change here. Here I'm just using my my blending stick to smooth out some of this front plane, this side plane on the table, and this big dark shadow here. Okay, also what it's doing is just sort of cleaning up some of the tones around the margin. Put a little light on this green stem. A lot of little skinny highlights on this canister here, so I'm going to use my green eraser and just start to pick out some of these little skinny parts, these up-facing shiny areas on the metal surfaces, little highlights. They translate basically to little streaks of light or little lines, pulses. You just sort of have to get interpretive a little bit. Try to observe what you see. That's what a lot of artists think is fun, is trying to establish details on something like this. I'm going to use my blender to kind of polish in some of these areas that I've been working on. Often what I'm doing is just smoothing out some darker colors. Smoothing out dark spaces or things that are going away from me. Something is going back in space. That's the place where you want to push it in with your blender. Kind of a simple rule of drawing. When you push in, something seems to go away from you. It's softer, it has the appearance of dropping away. A lot of little speckles and things here on the surface that as the drawing gets more mature it starts to clean up, so to speak. It looks a little less busy, a little less noisy, starts to become more clear. And what I'm doing is just using my blender to sort of push in some of the shadows, some of the farther planes. And I'm already down to this corner, so I should, recognize that, and I've got to pace myself and bounce back and pick up some of these other things that I haven't completed yet. So you got to remember, hey, where did I start? You've been kind of developing some, more finishing, getting closer to finishing looking things over here. But back here it's still all rough, so you got to remember, all right, where do I start? How do I get back into this? So I'm making some changes to this image. I'm going to remove that far statue, so I have to make some decisions about how to handle that color back there. This is just a piece of cotton t-shirt rag, and what I'm doing is just blending some of the negative space back there, the negative space, the space tone. What would be that shadow, that other statue in the background, I'm just going to remove that. I still want to have some light back there in the center of my picture. So I'm probably not going to completely darken that space tone right there. But I do need to calm it down and push it to the back. So what I'm doing is blurring that background even farther using a piece of cloth. Let's call it kind of like a digital blur in a sense. I'm actually using a piece of cloth or gauze to blend that stuff, pushing it back. It's just a piece of cotton t-shirt rag. It's got a little bit of dirt in, charcoal in it already. Helps to kind of smooth things out. Pushing back things that are farther away from me. Smoothing out parts of charcoal that just look too speckly. Even stuff that you've been erasing, take some tissues or some towels or some chamois and occasionally just swipe over some of those things you've been working on. It helps to soften and integrate. So I'm kind of reglazing just a little bit here before I start to erase again. I guess that's what's happening. A little bit of wipe some more glaze into some of these areas, smoothing things out a tiny bit more, and I'm back to my pink pearl. And I also have my gray eraser. Sorry, saying that wrong. I have a pink pearl and a stick eraser. I think, some of these smaller parts I typically want to grab my stick eraser. I'm going to put some light right down the edge of that flower stem. Remember, it's often not really full pressure. I'm just kind of tapping at something. Sometimes, you just have to glaze it a couple times. May have to redraw it a little bit to get some of the final details as well. Things really clean up. You tap them with that eraser a little bit, pull up some light, and then just come back with your blender here and kind of smooth out. Keep smoothing and forming your shapes, your parts, your space. Okay, that's good. I got those stems in there, and now put the rim of the cup in there. And what I'm doing, I'm thinking about my eraser like it's the light source itself. It's hitting some of these little tops and ridges, and it has a kind of dynamic to it as well. So I'm not always pressing to full speed or full strength, and sometimes I'm pressing really hard and then it's kind of flowing, or it changes as I'm moving. So even my swipes change pressure, so I'll start hard and kind of fade out, for example. That's typically what you would do, is you would pressurize first and then swipe and lift as you go. Take your time, count out some of those ridges and planes, make sure you're getting in alignment with the stuff that you're erasing. This is what you drew. Got to find that balance between being careful and being too slow. Yeah, you can be too slow and things look clunky, and you kind of lose your pace. But you can also be, too quick, and things can look, unfinished or unresolved. Reflected light here on the bottom of the edge of the statue that I want to establish. It's one of the brighter shapes in this area, actually. My cotton t-shirt rag, again, mine is kind of dirty on purpose. Just going to soften some of this space tone back here behind the succulent. Again, stuff that's farther away, you have to kind of let it relax a little bit. Be willing to swipe over it with your towel, clean towel, or your eraser sometimes to help set it in place and push it back to the right space in the picture. Okay, I'm going to leave that alone for now. And here on the top of this metal, there's a highlight setting up on this rim. Use my green stick eraser here. Create a highlight on this ridge. Couple more little reflections here and light. Not as bright, so don't press as hard. Up facing plane, got a little bit of a shine on it. Just kind of not erasing the camera, skipping the object in front of it right now. And working on this thing back here because that's further back. Stuff kind of looks a little blurry at first, but you just got to have some trust or have some faith in the process, trust the process. That if you start to tap at, swipe at, and lift up some of these shadows, some of these highlights, some of these lights, and you come back, you can start to use your blender, cotton, chamois, etc. to smooth out some of the roughness of the erasing that, this sort of evolution happens. The drawing starts to come to focus more. And it can come into focus in very surprising and fast and also satisfying ways too, if you are prepared for it, and you also are not too judgmental about what you're doing yourself. So that's another part of kind of hurdle beginners often have to deal with, is not knowing if something's good enough before they progress on to the next thing. And I don't have a real concrete answer. You just have to start to develop a kind of tolerance for things that are slightly unfinished. Knowing that if you leave it, you're the artist, you can come back here and you can continue later on to develop this part when it's more appropriate to the workflow of your piece. So I'm already down to the bottom of this metal vase, and there's another kind of mat board or index card, card of some kind down here on the table. Start to swipe out some light on this up-facing plane here, top of the table. Also keeping the margin clean as I work too, so that I know where my white point is. The margin is telling me what white should look like. Everything else in the piece has got to be a shade of gray. So I have the same tools in my hand, a cotton rag, an eraser, a blending stick. If you don't have enough charcoal deposited on your drawing already, you're not going to have this exact same result. So one of the things that you have to kind of do as a beginner is make sure that you're using enough charcoal in your early phases of your setup, so that you have this sort of foundation layer that you can blend and work with. It's a little bit like clay, I think. You get the clay kind of spread out, and then you can start to smooth it out and form it, and it becomes malleable. I kind of miss some little things back here. There's some lights, little streaks of light on the bottom of the vase, and there's some top planes on some cloth over here. Go back and fix that up. It doesn't take much, just a couple little squiggles or shapes of light back there. I'm also looking at contrast here. It's brighter behind the picture at the edge, so I'm trying to bring that shape into more focus as well. Big cast shadow right here to the left side of the vase or the picture. So just kind of smoothing out some of these rough edges, pushing back the shadow shapes and the deeper pockets of space, and then using your eraser to lift the lights. Starts to bring things into focus. The best thing you can do really is just kind of keep softening at something. Soften it up, and then you can use your eraser again to keep lightening. Here's my cotton cloth. As these grays get smoother and more polished, you know, it just becomes a little easier to decode what's happening over here. And then the margin is my white point. What I'm doing is starting my eraser actually off of the paper and just dragging it along the edge of the sheet. And I also am using a kind of a scribbly hatch here occasionally. And then some of that shape and roughness is coming from my initial lay-in of charcoal too. And that's my cotton t-shirt rag. I'll just keep working on that margin. It's an important part of your piece. And I'm encouraging you to be able to develop skills to do it by hand. So that would be skills of observation about the tones that are happening on the inside of the image, and also skills to control your charcoal so you don't let it get too thick and piled up on, going off of the paper, but really are kind of trimming it back and continually pushing it into the inside of the frame. Okay, I've got a couple more pieces here. I want to develop some more. So back to my main tools for erasing. I got my green and my pink. Start right here at the leading edge of this box, this camera case. There's a highlight here on the corner. I'll define that highlight first and that top plane on that camera, using something a little bit smaller. I could have used a pink pearl probably, but I wanted to kind of pull it out as a little bit of a line. Little ridge here facing up, color change. I'll swipe off a little bit. Probably going to have some highlights, some reflections here along that edge. So what I'm doing is just kind of taking my eraser and pinstriping, in a sense, some of the shapes. Some light here, and I got a shadow system here at the front of the object with sit core, rim core, and light happening right here, just like we've been studying all semester. I'm going to keep that front edge, that underscore of that camera nice and clean, and have a little bit of darkness right there where that camera is touching down. Sharp edge. Should be able to see a sit core and a rim core inside of there. Blender maybe to help smooth out some of these outlines and things that aren't that far off, but are just still a little clumsy from the initial tracing or lay-in. I can see I'm going in the wrong direction. That's going to need a little darkness back there to pop that out. Lighten this side of the camera. Push that space tone back. Let's pull out some light here on some of these bezels. I'm going to try to interpret. There's a texture there as well as highlights. And color changes. Again, don't be too critical of what you're doing. If you're looking too in a way, it's like if you think you're overanalyzing it, you're gonna maybe overwork it. You just gotta observe. Just trust that you're gonna. You put those highlights down that you are seeing in your top planes, and you swipe out your tops. that you're going to be okay. Let there, what am I also saying? You have to not overanalyze your own mark making too much. Everybody's going to be a little bit different, and it's a constantly evolving, artist thing. How you articulate your moves. So you're always going to be changing and learning as you go. But the point here is that you don't need to be too worried about how it looks in terms of the shapes and the edges and that stuff. Your marks, your roughness, your looseness that you impart to the drawing is your style too. And it might seem kind of, what am I saying, kind of rough or even a little bit kind of emotional in a sense to you, but to your viewer, your hand, your work looks interesting, looks intriguing, and especially if it has a kind of roughness that is correlating to the image or to the picture that you're drawing. So let there be some roughness here, but also still really try to draw that thing. And just accept that, a couple of whatever brush strokes, paint strokes, are hatch marks, swipes. Those are good things in the overall scheme of becoming a creative person. That's your style. That's your vocabulary. That's your handwriting. Okay. Got some highlights here on the pear. I'm just using this green eraser. Lift out some of those brighter shines right in the middle, but I'm going to switch to my pink pearl now. Swipe out some of these broader tones. And I like the pink pearl because it has a kind of bite, but it also lets me have a kind of range too, so I don't have to swipe off too much. Your gray eraser is going to have a similar, that's your kneaded eraser, have a fairly similar. There's some reflected light here. So the key here is we're looking for erasers that have a range, in a sense that they're not just on or off, that you can lift partial veils of charcoal too. Looking at contrast, that means what's lighter or darker? The pear or the camera? This is my blender now. The camera is now the background. I have to blend into the camera a little bit to get it to set up next to the pear. Same with the base back there. When you're trying to integrate or get lots of complex parts to come together into an image, you have to blend those edges where things are coming together. Digital art is all about this. That's how you merge photos and all that fancy stuff, is that, as you are splicing or compositing things together, you have to blur the edges, help to weave things together. Blur the outlines and the edges and the spaces right around things, but leave the details in the front middles of objects nice and clear and contrasty and focused. Okay, I'm missing some highlights here on this glass. Probably just forgot to trace them in, or I maybe just masked over them too much. So I think what I want to do in this case, for something really shiny, prominent in the front here, I'm going to take my charcoal pencil and I'm going to draw some of these shapes, these kind of organic looking rectangles that are the lights in the room. And there's a couple different kinds of highlights. There's in the classroom we have square lamps on the ceiling, and we also have round lights over the still life. So that's why you're kind of seeing different shapes of highlight. In the studio, we have two different shapes of light on the still life. So these are just direct reflections of the lights on the ceiling. There's a couple of round spotlights here in the very middle that are right over the table. And then, the secondary room lights are also on too. Just want to take my pencil here and redraw a couple of the shapes inside of this dark bottle that somehow I missed as I was setting up the original drawing. Here I'm just kind of tracing the edge of the statue shape, and there's a shadow up here from the bottom. I want to reglaze that new work slightly. So I haven't really had to do a lot of extra work on this piece. I got enough charcoal on it before I glaze. But if you didn't get enough charcoal before you glaze, what has to happen is you have to add more. You have to add more swipes of charcoal. And then I have to reglaze a little bit. I want to do that so that I get back in the order, which was what I was doing, is erasing and using my blending stick. Okay, so highlights are re-established here. I can take my green eraser and lift the top planes on the glass the way I want. What I'm doing is just kind of putting my eraser right into that highlight shape that I just erased. And that little rim, or that drawing edge of those shiny shines gives that erasing just enough contrast and focus that it stands out and looks bright. You can try to just erase into a charcoal mask to get a highlight, but it doesn't have the same kind of detail and focus as establishing a little bit of a rim around your light first. My blending stick. So what I'm doing is going back and around some of those areas that I was just erasing in the highlights. Still softening, smoothing out that color behind, the base color of the glass. Gotta remember that glass, it's very tricky for beginners. You're seeing a lot of detail in it, but it never gets brighter than the statue behind it. Now what I'm doing is actually erasing some of the edge, or erasing around the bottle, kind of just swiping over the statue. I'm not too worried about it. I have to get that a little bit lighter back there for the contrast on the bottle to work. Again, what's happening is something that was previously a positive form is now becoming a negative space form. So I have to think about the edge and some of the areas of this form behind here slightly differently than I was previously, in order to get the edges and the shapes to integrate correctly. Okay, I'm just going to take off some of the light on the statue now through the bottle. And then I'm just going to I'm seeing transparency here. Seeing some of the table back there. I think I should just add a little bit of charcoal right here. I want to go a little darker. Okay, let me see. Got a little piece of negative space here of the table. It's in light, so it needs to get lifted out. And I also want to start to work on some of the light effects on the top of the leaf too. Again, find that kind of organic rhythm, movement, flow, but also got to combine it with observation. Getting the marks and the shapes in the right place, and also letting them have sort of the right speed and movement. Part of the learning. Maybe little highlights and streaks along the outlines and edges of shiny green things. Now the other thing about this leaf that's going on currently is that it's going to need to get a lot darker than it is. So it's a little bit challenging, I think, for beginners to figure out if it's on the right track, because I still have to add quite a bit of dark here underneath of the leaf, and some extra dark in some of these planes that are facing down on this green color. As a rule, green is going to register in black and white as a fairly dark value. You know, at least middle to gray to 75%. And sometimes you may even see some shadows on green that are almost all the way to black. So this is really going to clean up when I get that cast shadow blocked in, and I'm also going to probably need to smooth out some of, keep working on smoothing out some of these planes in here. Pushing them in with your blender. You remember it took a few minutes to get some of that other stuff started, so you might be getting a little impatient. You probably should take a break if that's you know, anytime you're starting to work on a new object, you got to remember, hey, you know, I'm doing something new, and I have to remind myself of a set of steps, and I can't get ahead of myself, and I can't get impatient, and I can't make it magically become more finished than it is. I have to go through these steps every time with every object, and I have to be in a fresh mental state, the right state of mind to do it. Again, what's happening, you know, I just erased, and now I'm using my blender to smooth out some of these speckly dark colors in the leaf and in the shadows and in the space tone around the object. As some of these colors get a little more blended, it just starts to drop back in space a little better, you can see a little more focused. And you also got to remind yourself, hey, don't overdo it. I got to keep pace. And I gotta not censor myself too much in some of those early swipes and erasing phases. You're going to get a lot of time to go back now after all this is erased, and use your pencils and your Contis and other tools, your your Heritage charcoal, to bring more focus and softness and other kinds of effects. So you've got to establish this erasing pattern, and then you kind of come back and add more dark, and that's the workflow.